Proposition 2. State Budget. Budget Stabilization Account. Legislative Constitutional Amendment. Plain language, change the way California manages its rainy day emergency fund. What does it do? It requires that 1.5% of general fund revenues be put into the state emergency fund. When personal capital gains taxes add up to more than 8% of the general fund, everything over the 8% must be put into the state emergency fund, and in some cases, a special emergency fund for schools. It requires that half the state emergency fund be used to repay state debts and all future expenses that we don't currently have funds set aside to pay. It allows the limited use of emergency funds in cases of emergency and budget deficits. It states that the emergency fund can be no more than 10% of the general budget. Anytime the emergency fund surpasses 10%, the overage will be reallocated to infrastructure. Long story short, Proposition 2 seeks to change the California Constitution rules concerning the emergency fund in order to allocate more money to the California State Emergency Fund to pay down debts faster and have money available for emergencies and budget deficits. It also creates a new law that would lower the amount of money school districts can keep in their emergency funds. Fiscal Impact. The fiscal impact of Prop 2 cannot be predicted precisely, but the net result would be saved interest on debts that would now be paid down faster, fluctuation in the amount of state emergency fund money depending on the economy, and smaller emergency funds for some school districts. A little history. This year, the state plans to spend about $55 billion from the general fund on education. California's biggest revenue source is the personal income tax, so obviously when the economy is good, state revenue goes up, and when it's bad, it goes down, and we get spending cuts and tax increases. Ideally, the rainy day emergency fund is used to put money into when times are good and draw money from when times are bad. In 2004, California passed Prop 58, which established our current emergency fund. The plan was set up so that 3% of the general fund revenues would go into the emergency fund until the fund capped out at about $8 billion. However, the governor can decide to put less than that or even nothing into that account if he decides to do so, and the legislature can withdraw from the emergency fund with a majority vote. There is no limit on the amount that can be withdrawn each year. This was the first year since 2007 that the governor decided to put money into the emergency fund. State law requires that school districts keep at least between 1% and 5% of their annual budget in their own emergency fund, although some school districts voluntarily keep much more. California's state debt is around $300 billion. It is owed primarily to public pension and retirement health benefits, and to local governments like school districts, counties, and cities. Here are a few important changes from the old emergency fund rules that Prop 2 would enact. Before, an optional $3 billion was supposed to go to the emergency fund. This law would impose a mandatory $800 million to $2 billion a year. The governor would then be required to put the money in the emergency fund unless he declares a state emergency and the legislature agrees. The emergency fund cap would be increased from 5% of the general fund to 10% of the general fund. The amount that can be withdrawn from the emergency fund could only be enough to fund the emergency expenses. Before, the state did not keep emergency funds for schools. This would require it to do so during high revenue years. Before, school districts were required to keep a certain minimum amount of money in their emergency funds, but there was no maximum. This law would create a maximum, between 3% and 10% depending on the size of the district. This maximum could be waived in extraordinary circumstances. From Yes on Prop 2. Prop 2 will establish a strong rainy day fund in the state constitution to save money when times are good, pay down debts, and protect schools from devastating cuts. By forcing the state to save money, politicians will be required to live within their means, and it will protect us from unnecessary tax increases. 3 years ago, California faced a $26 billion budget deficit that required the legislature to make painful cuts for voters and approve temporary tax increases. Prop 2 will make sure we don't repeat this cycle of boom and bust budgeting. Prop 2 will stabilize the state's budget, accelerate the state's debt payments, create an educational reserve to avoid future cuts to schools. Credit rating agencies and newspapers support a strong rainy day fund. Contrary to what the No on 2 people say, the current state budget is the best we've had in years for schools, providing more than $10 billion more in new funding. We're now spending $1,954 more for each student than just 3 years ago when California faced a huge budget deficit. From No on Prop 2. Why does a so-called rainy day fund get to soak California school children? Parents and taxpayers often ask why California is one of the bottom 10 states in school funding year after year, yet our tax rates are among the highest in the nation. Prop 2 is a perfect example of how we keep protecting school children by putting them last. Prop 2 contains a dangerous financial time bomb that was inserted at the last minute that hurts schools. After even a penny goes into Prop 2's emergency fund for schools, local school districts will only be allowed to save for, at most, a few weeks of expenses. Why does it matter if Sacramento can determine what school districts can save? For the last 7 years, Sacramento has delayed billions in payments to schools until after the end of the school year. Funds needed to pay teachers, staff, and suppliers. Without locally controlled reserves, districts would have faced higher borrowing costs and deeper cuts. Depending on Sacramento is a losing proposition for schools. Standard & Poor's reacted with neutral to negative credit implications for California schools if Prop 2 passes. Everybody supports a genuine rainy day fund, but ask newspapers and credit agencies if they support the shell game that Prop 2 has become. California is ranked 50th in the U.S. in per pupil spending. Sacramento does not have a track record in prioritizing public education. Local communities, not Sacramento, know what's best for our children. Small print allows the state controller during a budget emergency to move these educational reserves into the general fund. 25 years ago, Californians enacted Prop 98 as a minimum school funding guarantee. This guarantee was an excuse in 2004 for state politicians to begin grabbing $5 billion a year of stable, reliable, local school-allocated property taxes to fund their own deficits and poor financial decisions. The state took the money, promising to pay it back, but unsurprisingly, this constitutional guarantee to California school children has not been steadfastly met. Now, under Prop 2, after having to wait through bad years, California schools are supposed to wait through good years to receive this rainy day money from the state. What does local control mean if we can't trust local school boards with even their minimum constitutionally guaranteed revenues? A no vote on Prop 2 is a vote for kids, schools, and common sense. So I was all fired up to vote yes on this one, and then slowly by slowly the devil emerged from the details. I'll say up front that there are two things that I really like about Prop 2. It would require California to save, and it would require California to pay off debts. Sounds like a good day to me. But it's never that simple. Like many bills that politicians and lawyers draft, they put all the sunshine and cotton candy up top. Then at the bottom of the bucket, you find the dirty hairball caked with mildew, toe jam, and gutter slime. In this case, we see that this bill is written to transfer yet more power from local school districts up to the state level, and I don't like that. I spoke with a lady from No on Prop 2, and she made a good point. School districts are responsible for operations, results, maintenance, and success. Why shouldn't they be in charge of their budget? Why would a law create a provision that school districts wouldn't be able to save as much money as they need to stay solvent? At first, I thought the idea was that school districts would only save a certain amount and then the rest would go up to the state for the savings, but no. The law is written so that school districts are required to spend their savings until they reach the state-mandated maximum. They can spend it on books, supplies, teacher pay, anything. They just have to spend it. What? Why? So I called and emailed the Prop 2 campaign several times for clarification, but they were so convinced of their success based on poll numbers that they ignored all of my correspondence. So even though I like the parts of the bill that they keep on blabbing about, saving money and paying off debts, I can't get around the state centralizing more authority in Sacramento at the expense of schools, and the weird clause about limiting the amount that school districts can save. School districts should be able to operate in the way they see fit. Sacramento doesn't know the needs of every school district in this massive state. If you vote yes on Prop 2, you are voting to mandate a certain amount of rainy day savings each year and the paying off of state debts. Also, to make it harder to spend emergency fund money and to limit the amount of savings local school districts can keep. If you vote no on Prop 2, the California Constitution will remain as is. Sadly, the Darryl Johnson Show must say no on Prop 2.